All right, well, thank you everybody for coming and thank the organizers for having me. All right, today's talk, I kind of have three things I want to cover. The first part is really just kind of the advice part and some of the things that worked well for me as a PhD student as well as assistant professor. The second thing I want to talk about is kind of the ingredients to a good research paper. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot more as I'm starting projects and trying to evaluate the quality before I get too far on those. And the last thing I want to spend most of the time on is how to kind of deal with these new staggered diff and diff methods and how to think about these in terms of when we're setting up our research. All right, so let's start off with just kind of some thoughts and perspectives. So one of the things that probably worked best for me as a PhD student was really communicating with all the other PhD students. And so we would come in every morning and we would talk about ideas. Again, it doesn't have to be a fleshed out idea. It can be as simple as just, hey, I saw a news story, I saw a paper and a new method. But really working and talking with the other PhD students was huge for me. Not only that you learn a lot from your fellow PhD students, it helps you also develop more projects. And at least for me, I have a lot of failures. And so starting a lot of projects is really important because 99% of them almost fail. And so having more PhD students kind of working together on things really helped me get more projects PhD student, and then that helped a lot on the job market. The other thing then is, as assistant professor, is transitioning from the PhD program and getting projects started to getting them done. And so at least for me, a lot of the projects, they take years and years to actually get published. And so getting those off to journals earlier is really important, especially when you're on the short tenure clock. The other thing then is starting new projects. So getting those off and then starting the new ones and developing that pipeline. Again, like focusing on those has been really important in terms of getting more projects done and started. The last thing is associate professor. So this is the part where I'm still figuring out. Now that I'm an associate professor, I have more responsibilities, working with more junior, trying to advise PhD students. So trying to balance that time has been, it's been a challenge. The other thing that I've kind of found as an associate professor is all my colleagues and all my co-authors are associate professors now too. And so they're getting busier. And so it's again, slowing down the pipeline. And so trying to figure out how to build up that pipeline and remain productive is really important. So with that, the one thing that I really want to do better, and these are the areas that I struggle with most, is networking and developing kind of co-authorships with more senior faculty. So again, you're going to learn a lot from the senior faculty and avoid a lot of the pitfalls that you would make early on. And then networking is really important. Again, when I'm now an associate professor, all the other associate professors are busy. And so having a bigger co-author network becomes more and more important. The other thing I think I wish I would have done a lot better is my approach to research has been probably more opportunistic or kind of a shotgun approach, but really focusing on one specific area and becoming an expert. I do think there is a lot of value to that, and if you're able to do that, that is extremely important. The other major thing in terms of some of the stuff that the challenges I ran into when starting projects is not paying enough attention to the contribution of research design at the beginning. So we've probably all had these papers where we know we have some endogenous X variable that we're looking at. And so we'll have a robustness section where we apply some instrumental variable or diff and diff research design. I don't think that's going to cut it anymore. I think we need to kind of focus on those, and those IV and the identification needs to be the main part of the paper going forward, especially for these top journals. And then the last thing, and again, this kind of goes back to this, hey, as an associate professor, how do you remain productive? And I think developing the PhD students, so those who have PhD programs, making sure that those PhD students develop into good RAs, good co-authors, can help with that productivity. All right. So the other thing, and this is actually advice I got from Mike Littrey, and I can't remember where he got it from, but he was talking about what makes a good research project. And it really boils down to three things. It's your research question, your data, and the identification strategy. And if you can have all three of these, then you have a good chance at the top journals. You don't necessarily need all three, but having them is really helpful. And so when we think of the research question, like, has it been answered? Again, if it's already been answered, do we really need to look at it again? So what is the tension? And then the other one is this question important? So even though it hasn't been answered, if it's not important, again, that's going to kind of hurt you in terms of the publications. The other major thing is the data. And so data, we've all used CRISP, we all use CompuStat, but having new and novel data in itself can be a contribution. The other major thing is you're going to have certain research questions if you're interested in things related to employee wages. Well, getting into actually LEHD data, census data, that's kind of where you need to be because that's going to tie closely to what you're interested in. If you're trying to use CompuStat data for questions related to wages, you're going to kind of have an uphill battle. And so being able to tie the data as close as you can to your research question, that helps a lot. And then the last thing is just your identification strategy. So how well can we address endogeneity and causality? The tighter that is, the better your chances are at these top journals. And again, all three of these don't necessarily need to be there to have a good research paper. And in terms of the importance, we'd like to have the research question be the most important, but there's definitely times where we feel like the identification strategy is just as important as the research question. So kind of keeping that in mind. All right, so that's the advice. The last thing I kind of want to talk about is kind of the concerns that we've had with the staggered diff and diffs. And so we've all kind of either written some language of this if we're using a staggered diff and diff paper where we have the adoptions of some policy or laws over time that will say something on the lines of a benefit of staggered implementation is that firms can be in the treatment and control groups at different times. And this sounded really great 5 years ago. But now that we've seen, there's been a lot of research kind of calling into question that kind of statement. And so the main kind of takeaway from a lot of these papers is that what they show is that this two-way fixed effect, so when we just have the firm year fixed effects in the staggered research design, it's really a comparison of these 4 2x2s. And this is going to be your early treated versus never treated, your later treated versus never treated. And those are kind of your best comparisons because you're looking at the never treated and like there's going to be no problems for them being a control group. You also have the early treated versus later treated, and those are your not yet treated. And so again, assuming there's no anticipation, the treatment groups are not super different than the control groups, those are also valid comparisons. Where you run into problems, and this is like the whole literature is trying to solve, is this later treated versus early treated, or those that are already been treated. And so the way to think about this, and the way that the problem arises is what they call these heterogeneous treatment effects. And so if you don't have a shock that happens immediately, and if the shock is different across different treatment units, you end up with potential biases. And so all these methods, whether it's the Callaway-Santana, the Woolridge, it's all about addressing that heterogeneous treatment effects. And so to kind of recap where we have problems, and this is coming from Baker, Larker, and Wing, you do not have a problem if you do not have a staggered diff and diff. If you just have a standard diff and diff around, say, the financial crisis or COVID, these are not issues. You also do not have issues if you do not have heterogeneous treatment effects. So again, as long as the shock happens immediately and is equal across groups, you don't have to worry about this. There's going to be no bias. Where you run into biases is when you end up with, again, the treatment effect happens over time or it's unequal across the groups. And of course, if you have both of those, that's where the bias is going to be the most problematic. And in terms of the formula, and this is, I think, where they get this negative weight, it's kind of where people talk about these negative weightings, it's in this last term. And so what they show here is that the treatment effect is essentially the variance-weighted average treatment effect. That's what we care about. You also have a term that's the variance-weighted common trend. That's the parallel trends. And we're going to assume that's 0, and we try to test for it as much as we can. Even though, again, parallel trends you can't actually test for, we can at least provide some analysis to say whether there's a problem or not. But usually we're going to assume that's 0. And again, it's this last term, this minus delta average treatment effect. That's the bias and the negative weighting that's coming about from comparing those later treated to the earlier treated. And so that's what we try to fix. And so in terms of what we need to think about as researchers and reviewers, and I'm going to apply this to an example later on of a new project I'm working on and some of the things we thought about as we were going through this project. And so the first thing is, like, how important are these corrections? Is this a situation where all we need to do is say, hey, we run our normal OLS regressions, we got our firm and our year fixed effects, we got this post-treatment variable, and we're just going to run robustness using these corrections, say, hey, we run this using Callaway-Santana or some other method, and is that enough? We try to look at the AFA, so one of my RAs and PhD students, Depeche, who's in the audience, he looked at the AFA papers and found 30 papers use some form of staggered diff and diff. 23 use one of the new methods to correct for this bias, but only 7 use it as the main specification. And my guess is right now that's probably okay, but going forward, I think we're going to have to consider this as our main methodology. So we're going to have to deal with this issue and these biases in staggered diff and diff right in section 2 and 3 when we're talking about our identification strategy. I don't think we're going to be able to keep putting this off into a robustness section and hoping that that's going to be enough. The other thing then is, which method do we use? So there's lots of different methods. There's Sun and Abraham, Callaway-Santana, Woolridge has some, and then other ones that I'm going to talk about in preferred. But we're all going to end up with certain preferences for different methods. And so most likely we're going to have to choose a main one and have to do robustness on it. The other thing that you run into, there's pros and cons of different methods. Like some of them can handle controls better than other ones. Some can handle cross-sectional analysis better than others. So these are things we need to think about as we're kind of designing the paper. And related to that then, it's like, how do we do with our normal methods or normal types of analyses that we like to conduct? And so a lot of things I like to do in my papers is have industry year fixed effects. Well, it turns out a lot of times in these new methods, once you kind of get down to say like a 3-digit SIC industry fixed year fixed effect, they all break down. None of them can estimate, they don't converge. And so like that is a potential limitation of these new methods. Anytime you get into something that's more complex than just pure OLS, it's going to be less robust and it's going to have issues in terms of converging. And so we need to kind of think about that. And then of course that affects us as reviewers. So there's always these comments we want the authors to kind of conduct. But if they're using these new methods, we have to kind of realize that there are limitations to them and they might not be able to do everything we would normally like them to do. All right, so as I mentioned, I want to apply this to a new paper that we're working on. And this is a paper with Scott Guernsey at UTK and Chang Yan at Essex. And what we're doing is we're looking at the labor market effects of marijuana legalization on firms' cost of equity. And so the main part of the paper, and I don't want to kind of focus on the paper, I want to focus on the method part, is what we're looking at is what are the financial implications of this medical marijuana legalization on firms. And so there's been a huge kind of interest in, again, legalizing marijuana, whether it's medically or recreationally, in the last 20 years. And so understanding the costs and benefits from a lot of different angles we think is important. And so we're going to take the view, then look at this from the lens of firms' financing costs and look at the overall costs of this legalization. For implied cost of equity, that's going to be our main measure. And for those who don't know, again, your implied cost of equity, it's just a discount rate that makes the future cash flows equal to the current price. Right? So we're not going to use realized returns. We're going to focus on this implied cost of equity. We'll have CRIS, CompuStat, IBIS as our primary data sets. And again, we're going to have a staggered different diff. And just real quick in terms of what the key finding is, we're going to actually find that cost of equity decreases after legalization. And we're going to argue and kind of provide evidence that this is through reducing labor market frictions. And so this result is consistent with Bello et al. They have a Journal of Political Economy paper that basically says that firms that are expanding and they have some productivity shock that they want to continue to invest and expand and grow, if they face some type of labor market friction, they can't do that as fast as they want. And so profits take a while to realize. And because of that, they have a higher equilibrium rate of return. And so if medical marijuana can actually improve labor market conditions, and we provide evidence of this in terms of inflows of workers after the adoption, this is actually going to reduce those search frictions and reduce that equilibrium return. All right, so the first thing is just thinking about in terms of our check marks and is this a good study or not? I'm going to be a little generous to ourselves on this. This was one that was we debated a lot whether to kind of pursue the project, and in the end we decided to give it a try. But we think the question has not been answered. We haven't been able to find anything related, and we think it's important enough. And again, there's a lot of interest, it's timely, and trying to understand the overall cost. Again, we think it's important. Whether other people will agree with us, we'll see. But we think it's at least checks those boxes. Where we lose some points is the data. And so when you think of the implied cost of equity, again, these are going to be estimates. So there's always problems when you're dealing with the estimates. All right, but we don't lose a lot of points on that because the way that the traditional method is you're going to use IBIS forecasts, and we'll do robustness using other types of forecasts. But using the IBIS, CRISP, CompuStat, that is going to be the traditional method. We loop some points. It's not super novel data. It's just our traditional data sources. And then, of course, the problem you have anytime you're dealing with trying to assign some state law, some labor policy to a firm, you're dealing with headquarters information or locations, which is not ideal. But these are situations that it becomes kind of tricky. So we're interested in a firm level policy, but we have a state level variable. So even if we had census data, we had exact locations, it's not even clear how to aggregate that up to a firm level because you couldn't just take a weighted average and then apply normal diff and diff type analysis. And so like it's kind of a tricky situation. And then what tipped the balance in terms of whether we pursue it is, again, we have a pretty good identification strategy. It's just a standard staggered difference in difference analysis. So we know what we need to do in order to kind of check all the boxes in terms of identification. All right, so a real quick overview before I kind of talk about the method we're going to use to address these staggered and different biases is just a little bit of overview. And so the first state to pass or legalize medical marijuana was California in 1996. And since then, there's been 38 states that have legalized. I think there's 23 states that have done it recreationally. And in our sample, 22% of the observations are from never treated states. And so again, if you remember our kind of 4 or 2x2 comparisons, having never treated observations is ideal. The more you have of those, the less bias you're going to run into because of the staggered diff and diff. And so with 22% of being never treated, that's not a lot. And so that kind of is the first red flag. The second thing is we try to run this Goodman-Bacon decomposition. And so anybody kind of familiar with this, what you're trying to do is say like, how much of your average treatment effect is due to these bad comparisons? And we run it, we get about 21% of the treatment effect is due to this. And so we think that's large enough to be like, all right, we need to kind of consider this as our main methodology and how we're going to address these potential biases. One thing I'll mention in terms of the Goodman-Bacon decomposition, at least in Stata, there's two programs. So this whole decomposition was based on balanced data, or a balanced panel data. But we almost never have balanced panel data. And so like, how do you deal with it? So there's some programs that won't even let you run. It just tells you you have unbalanced panel and you can't do anything. There was another program that lets you run it. You get an error message and it takes a few hours to run, but eventually it does run, and that's where we get these estimates. And so that's kind of another point about these new methods. They've been designed on specific types of data, and like in this case, a balanced panel. And so like how to apply that to our own research where we don't meet those requirements, again, it can be tricky. All right, so the method we're going to choose, and this has kind of been my preferred one, is from Barusiak, Jarvel, and Spice, and I apologize to those authors. But it's a diff and diff imputation method. I like this one because it's built on OLS regressions. And so like their underlying code is based on like regHDFE. And so like that really helps in terms of being able to conduct most of the things we would like to do in terms of normal diff and diff. And so here's how it works. So our normal kind of two-way fixed effects, staggered diff and diff, we'd have our outcome variable. We got firm fixed effects and we got year fixed effects. And then we have this really, we call it a post variable, but it ends up being a treat times post. And so this D variable, that's just going to equal 1 after the state has adopted these laws. And so the way the diff and diff imputation method works is it breaks this down into 3 steps. And so you can kind of think of this as kind of a multi-step estimator. And the first thing you do is you try to get the estimates on these coefficients for the firm, year, and the coefficients on the untreated observations. So basically you can just take the sample, look at all the observations that haven't been treated. So these are the never treated group or the not yet treated group, run these regressions and get these coefficients. Like that's it. And so you can do this on your own in just normal regression, and it's very straightforward. Then what you do is you use those values to impute what you would expect to be essentially the treatment effect if they were not treated. And so we can get these average treatment effects for every observation by taking the actual value minus this expectation that's based on these estimated coefficients. And so like that, again, very straightforward. And then what it does is you just aggregate it. You're going to take a weighted average across all the observations where these weights depend on treatment assignment and timing. And so again, compared to some of the other methods, again, this is, at least for me, been the most straightforward one. And again, I'm going to kind of sell this a little bit, but one of the really nice things about the diff and diff imputation, and here's just some of the code, it can handle control variables and higher order fixed effects really well. Again, it can cluster at multiple dimensions. And again, the reason why it's able to do all this is it's based off of the regHDFE and Stata. And so anything you can kind of do there, you can do in this diff and diff imputation. And so in our paper, we built this up in our main methodology. So we're going to use the diff and diff imputation throughout the whole project. And so we run our main results, and we basically get these average treatment effects in this kind of minus 50 basis point range. But I want to kind of highlight a couple things here. So, and this also kind of goes back to reviewers. So again, these are going to be new methods that we kind of have to think about, and like, how should we review these papers? And so we put a table in the paper that looks something like this. We've got our model without controls, and we have controls. But these are actually 2 different steps. So again, remember, the controls and all the coefficients on the controls are estimated in 1 step using all the pre-treatment data or untreated data. And then you use those values to calculate the imputed average treatment effect. And so even though it looks like a regression, it's actually 2 different steps. And so we just need to be aware of that. And same thing with that is you don't really have the normal R squared that comes from this because it's through this imputation method. And so again, these are just things we need to kind of be aware of as reviewers, saying like, hey, why don't they have these R squareds and reject papers or raise concerns about this when it really wasn't designed to have those. And as I mentioned, again, in terms of just the magnitudes, we get about a 50 basis point decrease in the cost of equity, which is relatively large relative to the mean cost of equity of 8%. All right, so the next thing is, again, with a diff and diff imputation, we need to be able to handle these parallel trends, and it's built to do this very well. And so there we can just add these pre-trend commands and these horizons to get the timing for both the post period as well as the pre-period. And there's kind of 2 things that, again, that we need to kind of pay attention to. Technically, these are 2 different estimations, and we just combine the graphs. And so the pre-trends are all estimated on the untreated observations. And then what you do is you impute the post data. And so there's a few things that are really nice about that. So one is all these post coefficients, those are not dependent on what the excluded reference group is in the pre-period. And so here we have pre-trends of 10. Diff and diff imputation is not set up to be able to exclude, say, t-1, t-2 as the reference group. it's set up to basically use the reference group as whatever is not in here. And so in this case, it's t minus 11 and before. All right, so that is one limitation of this method, where some of the other methods you can specifically tell it to exclude t minus 1. All right, so normally when we run our our OLS in this staggered, we exclude t minus 1 or we exclude some earlier period. And all it does is shift the graph up and down in that excluded period. But like, that's problematic. And so what happens is, if you can exclude a different reference period and it changes the shape of the graph, it changes the statistical significance of those post estimates as well as the point estimates. All right, so what's really nice about the different imputation is that it's not conditional on what that excluded reference period is. And so you don't have that problem. And so that's also what we find is very nice. The other thing that we find is really nice is it's really easy to kind of deal with heterogeneity and explore cross-sectional analyses. And so when you're dealing with a project, right, you've got a situation where, hey, we want our main effect, we need to run our parallel trends tests, and then we need to test the mechanism. You can do this directly. So in our case, we actually tested labor flows and labor market predictions and find evidence that, yeah, labor flows increase. But we also then test if the results are consistent with what the Bellow theory says. And so again, in their situation, it's the firms that are expanding who are going to be most affected by these search frictions. And so the firms that are growing the most or expected to grow the most should be affected more. And so what's nice about the diff and diff imputation is these is actually built into their commands. Where if you look at the Callaway, Santana, or any of these other ones, it's not clear how to deal with these cross-sectional analyses. It's not built in. You could potentially run sample splits using these methods, but again, it's not clear if all the statistical properties kind of flow through the same way. But within the diff and diff imputation, there's just a HEPI command. So what you can do is create your cross sections. You can include this as just above or below median or multi-levels, and it'll estimate these. You can also then interact this cross section with the fixed effects and all the controls. And again, this is the only method that I know that can handle this in this way. And so the first one is like taking the cross section and interacting with post. The second one, where we interact the cross section with all the fixed effects, is close to your sample splits. So it's a fully interactive model, which again, you could get by doing sample splits and testing the coefficients. And then once you run these, then you can just test if the coefficients are different between the high and the low groups. And again, as far as I know, this is the best one to be able to handle these cross sections. And again, at least for my research, I end up using a lot of cross-sectional analysis to test the mechanism. And so like, that was really important for us to be able to handle when we were setting up our research design. And as I mentioned, again, I prefer this one by Birusek, but other people might prefer other ones. And so ultimately, you run your mechanism test, and you're going to have to run some form of robustness probably using other methods. And so the two other methods are the Callaway Santana that we use, as well as Wooldridge. Except for they kind of have some issues. And so one thing for us that we have to be aware of when we do on the Callaway Santana is the standard errors. And again, I do everything in Stata. I don't know if this has been fixed in any of the other software, but it's set up to be that all the fixed effects have to be nested within the cluster. And so what this means is that we use historical headquarters locations. So firms can switch headquarters. So the firm fixed effects are not a subset of the state fixed effects. And so when you run this, you actually can't cluster by state. And so that's problematic for us. The other thing that I ran into, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what it is when you add controls, and specifically state level controls in Callaway Santana. And so within their method, there's a part where they basically estimate a propensity score, and this forms weights. And I think what's happening is when you include state level controls that don't vary across firms in a state, or they might not vary a whole lot across states, this creates problems in the estimates. And so like here, we run this result, we actually get bigger magnitudes, but it hurts the statistical significance. And again, I'm pretty sure this has to do within that propensity score in these state level controls. And if you were to do something where you control for like a state level law variable where there really is no much variation, I think the problem would be even worse than say controlling just for tax rates. The other one that I do like is Woolridge. And so Woolridge, their whole point to deal with this heterogeneous treatment effects is essentially just kind of create interact time trends with these cohort effects and then pull it out. And so that one also is very nice. And I found that one works pretty well related to the diff and diff imputation, except for it doesn't handle the cross-sectional analyses as well. And then the final thing I want to point out, though, is these problems. And again, we need to be aware of these as referees, as well as authors. And this is when we get into these higher dimensional fixed effects. So all these work pretty well when you're doing firm and year fixed effects. If you do firm and 2-digit SIC times year fixed effects, so these industry year, things do work. And in our case, the average treatment effect decreases from 49 basis points to 35, but the stat increases. But when we try to run this with a 3-digit industry year fixed effect, we run into problems. All right, so if we're doing something with product market papers, again, this becomes really tricky because normally in a product market paper, you want to control for these industry factors. And so in this case, you basically get an error message that says, hey, there's some collinearity in this untreated estimation, but not in the full sample. And it hasn't been clear to me how to kind of correct for that. I've been able to kind of get around it using some ad hoc filters, but nothing that's really been very satisfying in terms of being able to consistently produce the estimates. And so as reviewers, we just have to acknowledge that with these new methods, there's going to be limitations that we need to be aware of, and that we can only ask authors so much without having to move them into a different method entirely. All right, and so that's it. Thank you, everybody. For joining.